So this morning we are going to do the second in a series of events which are producing an oral history of the starting and development of Ananda. Last year we had a panel of mostly different speakers, but last year we covered the years that we called Ananda before there were houses. And all of that material is available on the web if you haven't seen it or have an interest in seeing it. This year we're going to cover the period between basically the second year of the community, 1970. We started the community in 69. So the second year of the community up through the beginning of the fire. And next year we'll cover the fire itself and how we handled that, because that was, of course, a pivotal point in the development of Ananda. But so now this time period, we're going to cover 1970 through June of 1976, which is when the fire came. And I want to give a little bit of an overview, and then we're going to have stories, and we'll drill down more into some of the things that were happening then. But that period of time was the time in which we made a number of not just single decisions, but we made a number of decision points that moved on into the community and formed the structure of a community. You know, when somebody is working with a bonsai, they very, very carefully tie the branches or clip the branches, or anyway, they know ahead of time where the shape of that little plant is going to go, and then they work to create the shape. Well, we didn't really know the shape of the plant, but what we did know is that we wanted some things and we didn't want others. But even that clarity had to take some time to develop. So I want to cover a few things that were important and have come on into the future of Ananda. One, I want to cover the spiritual aspect of the community, because it was during these years that Ananda firmly became dedicated to Master, and that people here were Master's disciples. Up until that time, that was not very clear. In the first year, it wasn't that clear. Secondly, we began to build houses. Thirdly, as Nitai is going to talk about, so I won't cover it very much, we began to educate the children, because we had a lot of children here at the time. Fourthly, we began to do businesses, because without an ability to support ourselves, the community would not have lasted. And fifthly, we began to have certain kinds of social patterns. We had a monastery, we had married people, we had people who were friends, we had group activities, and so on. So kind of the, what one might say, we worked a lot on producing the quality of life that we wanted as a community. So let me start with the spiritual aspect, because as I mentioned, the first year, although it was clear among a small group of people, Swamiji especially, and then, I don't know, maybe 15 or 20 people around him from 1969 through the winter up until the summer of 1970, it was clear to a small group of people that this was a community absolutely dedicated to Master and to this particular spiritual path. But there were many people who came here, who were drawn here, primarily because it was new, it was a time of communities and communes, and they were drawn more for the social community, free living out in the country, rural, all of those qualities. And they came, and while they were willing to try spirituality as something that was kind of like the price of admission. It wasn't in their DNA. There was one man who came here who had been a SRF monk for some period of time, and not that every one of them is, but this man was exceedingly rigid in his thinking. And he only lasted a short period of time, a few months, but shortly before he left, he kind of came disgustedly to Swami Kriyananda, and he said, all you have to do to be a member of Ananda is say you're off drugs and chant Om 3 times. And somewhere between that and a clear definition of discipleship is where the truth lay. But so by the time a lot of that got sorted out when we came to the first winter, because people who were here just because it was fun and easy and you could go to the river and a lot of kind of happy people around and you didn't have to pay any rent, and then the rains came and the cold came and the winter came, and about half the people left at that time. And most of those people were people who were not dedicated to our way of life. Others of us began establishing means of income over that winter. I went to San Francisco and started what became the incense and oils business, which for the next 6 years, when I was running it, was probably the major employer of people in the community. Benai also started a business, and you'll hear other aspects of people trying to figure out, if we're going to stay here, how can we stay here? Because up through the first year and a half, basically Swami paid all the bills. He paid the mortgage, not all the bills, he paid the mortgage, and which was a significant amount for a small group of people, especially people with virtually no income. But he said that he was willing to do that for the first year, but after that we had to figure it out for ourselves. And so we did have to figure it out for ourselves. But let me come back. So by the end of that first winter, the people who remained, the core group was firmly dedicated to Master, to Kriya Yoga as our spiritual path, to daily meditations, to all of the spiritual aspects that we see continuing in the community even unto this day. And so that became firmly established. And while there were still a few people that came, basically thinking that we were uptight because we didn't have a eclectic viewpoint, looking for all the masters. Isn't it all one? Isn't one master just as good as another master? And why do we? Those issues had gotten established so that this community was dedicated to Master and his path. And while we honored other masters, we didn't want to have to dance on eggshells here in our own home about what our spiritual path was. So Swamiji, of course, was absolutely instrumental in establishing that. He was the rock around which Ananda was built. And there is nothing at Ananda that exists today that didn't have his governing touch at the beginning and didn't have his magnetic energy helping establish it. So that being the most important thing of all in my estimation, because along with the clarity of dedicating this community and Ananda's work, it will get into the spread of Ananda outside of this one community, but at that time, up until about 1978, this is the only location of Ananda. And so when we talk about this community as being Ananda, it is true, but only temporarily true. But establishing this community as completely dedicated to Master and living according to his teachings not only defined the community, but it allowed the grace of Master, and it's, Master incarnated in part to bring in the energy of Dwapara Yuga. And he said that communities would be the lifestyle of Dwapara Yuga, and that eventually they would spread like wildfire. He called them World Brotherhood colonies. But so us living according to that guiding principle allowed the grace of Master and the grace of God in this age to flow behind us. So that became the wind in our sails that moved us forward. I'm convinced that if we had not been able to not only self-define, but living those principles, that Ananda would not exist today. And so that was established and became clearer and clearer. And so things like a monastery was established, both for men and for women. There were group meditations every day. There were meditations at work sites, and all of the energy, the spiritual energy. So everything that we were doing became infused with a spiritual energy. And now we can say, well, of course. But when you're starting out, it's not so much of course. How many people, how many groups of people who want to live according to God's principles and a particular path are actually able to pull it off, and pull it off against great challenges. So that's really, I think, the very, very most important trend of those first years was the clear establishment of our spiritual path. Secondly, we had to find a way to support ourselves. And that too could have gone in many ways. Most models at that time of communes had some sort of a group financial energy where everybody pooled their resources and nobody owned anything. Nobody, to the extreme where some communities you didn't even own your clothes. That you'd throw them all in a big washing machine and then you'd go and get a pair of pants that sort of fit. And if you had any income sources, that all went into a pool and it was all shared. And so that was more the dominant model out of which Ananda was created. And so now we look at our economics and they seem natural and normal, but at that time, really we were kind of an outlier in the sense that we were breaking the mold, breaking the model of what was there. So this again had Swamiji's energy behind it. He said that nature does not make sudden leaps, nor should people be expected to make sudden leaps. They tend to want to have patterns that have worked for many, many millennia, really, and to continue those patterns, but not to change the pattern so much, but to spiritualize them. So, in this community, we had private businesses. And we had the decision that the income that came in from the private businesses, whoever started that business, whoever was running it and involved in it, they had the right to decide how that income was going to be used, that it didn't all go into a common pot and some, group consensus or something decide that. We had a mix of private businesses and community businesses. So we had a meditation retreat, and that was kind of a community business. We had publications, and that was a community business. So there weren't private entrepreneurial energies that started those so much as they kind of were a group energy. But there were a number of private entrepreneurial businesses that started up, and those businesses produced the income. And so, as I've mentioned, incense and oils, Benai started a jewelry business. One of the big ones early on was carpentry. We had a builders guild. We had people who had skill in building, and we had a lot of other ones. But here I want to just talk about the trend, which was to allow there to be multiple models of financial energies or decisions and not have one group think. One of the things that has allowed Ananda to flourish is that we don't try to create a single environment. It's like a gardener having a single kind of soil and plant product, and everything has to fit into that mold. We're more like organic gardeners. We saw a video where some potato farmers in Idaho, because they're producing potatoes that have to fit a certain mold for basically for McDonald's, and then from that for all the fast food chains. So all of French fry potatoes have to be a certain kind of potato of a certain size. So they will plant fields that are 6 miles long and run tractors for 6 miles. Well, that single environment doesn't work with people. Maybe it works with potatoes. But one of the things that has allowed Ananda to flourish is that early on, Swamiji and then the rest of us realized that we had to have a lot of different little models. We had to have group housing, we had to have private housing, we had to have clustered housing, we had to have single housing, we had to have entrepreneurial businesses, group businesses, community businesses. We had to have places for married people, for monks and nuns, for families, all of the different environments that we see. Again, now it just seems, well, of course. But it was Swamiji who said that this is the normal pattern of life in villages and for mankind everywhere. And the thought that you mold people into one groupthink was not the right way to go. And that is, if you think about it, that is a departure from the religious and spiritual models, even a departure from the model that SRF, which was Swami's roots, was doing. You had one kind of lifestyle. You had monks, you had nuns, you had a certain economics that they got $25 a month for spending. That was it, everything. So there was a strongly established pattern for religious communities, and people who joined fit into that, or if they didn't, they left. And it reminds me, I'm going to tell a little joke, and I won't go on too long. I can feel the power behind me. But a little joke about, fitting in. So this young lady comes and she joins this monastic order. And the rule there in the monastic order is it's complete silence, and you only can say 2 words each year. And those 2 words are said to the Mother Superior. And so the first year, after the first year, this novitiate comes and says, "Hard bed." And the Mother Superior says, "Yes, my daughter, I know, but we feel that it's important that the body suffer a little so that we can live for God." So second year goes by, the nun comes and says, "Bad food." And again, the Mother Superior goes on with the explanation for that. Third year, the nun comes and says, "Want out." And the Mother Superior says, "Well, I'm not surprised. It's been nothing but complain, complain, and complain ever since you got here." And so that's fitting everybody into a mold. And so one of the trends was that we decided not to do that. That we have a wide variety of individual decisions, even to the extent that Swamiji defined our group energies as cooperative obedience, not obedience. And so then the economic patterns were beginning to produce the kind of, not ever any surplus, but the kind of at least flow that allowed us to stay on the land and exist here. And we began to build housing. And again, that housing had a variety of styles, a variety of placements and planning. In fact, Swamiji actually wanted, one of the things that he gave up as a dream was he wanted the community to have a uniform look. He grew up in villages in Switzerland where you looked and there was individual variation, but basically the housing had a unity and a kind of a overall sense of harmony to it. But the people who were here were not into overall harmony. They were into, I want my house my way with cedar shakes on the outside and nobody's going to tell me, And so one of the things that Swami gave up was his desire that the housing be more coordinated and more harmonious. But it allowed people to put their energies. It was more important that people feel individually empowered to put their own energies into the creation of the community than it was to have a harmonious style. And so housing began, and by the time of 1976, we had about 22 or 23 houses on the land. It was hard to count them because the gray line between a shed and a house, but at least it had to be more permanent than a teepee in order to count as a house. It had to have some construction to it. But that, and we began the beginnings of city planning or of land use planning that now has created clustering and utilities that go to one place and aren't spread all over. In the very beginning, it tended to be a sense of plant your house as far away from any other house as possible. And then roads had to go to it and all of the problems. But these early trends of group identity and group decision making that are still alive here in the community were very, very important. So I would say in summation that those first 6 years were the establishment of the ways that we were going to live together as a community and work together and mix with each other, and most importantly, how we were going to give our lives spiritually to a common ideal. Those were the establishing years of that, and we're still plucking the fruit off of that tree that grew that way.
So my name is Parvati, for those of you that may not know me. I'll talk about one of the businesses that I started, Master's Market, and also about the monastery. When Jyotish mentioned there weren't any surpluses, no, the surplus was that you got some money. You didn't not have to get it. You got some salary, not nothing. So I wanted to start by reading something from July 3rd, Living Wisely, Living Well, because this is what I felt from Swamiji and how the spirit in which he established the community. Be loyal to your principles, but never demand that anyone share them. Respect others' right to seek truth in their own way and at their own pace. And I'm glad that Jyotish mentioned that, because it was when I came to Ananda I was extremely grateful that there were a few people like Jyotish and Benai and others who started businesses, because it gave me a way to be here. I just arrived and I had a little bit of money. I could have stayed for a year or two, but those businesses, I went to work for Benai immediately. I mean, and again, the pattern that Swami established, absolutely that was essential. If you wanted a normal way to exist, then you had to have a job and you had to make money and you had to be able to spend that money in the way that you wanted to and not as a group. You know, people always say, oh yes, that commune, Ananda. And I say, no, we were never a commune. We were always a community, and now we're a village. But for me, those patterns were essential. That really saved me, because I knew I deeply wanted spirituality here, but I had to have a way to be here. And it also helped me to get into a normal rhythm of life. So with the market, I worked for Benai, and we wore gas masks, by the way. We poured resin into little round squares. They were beautiful little flower jewelry objects, but for most of the day we wore gas masks, and then we baked these in a little oven, and then we buffed them, and Benai went out and sold them. But I didn't care. It was a way to be here, and I was so thrilled to be living in a community that was about truth, that was master, that was yoga teachings, that was Swami, with a grounding, just that flowed, was a channel for master's teachings. So, but Swami was always saying to us, and he spent all his time really giving energy to people in the community, but almost every time we met, he would say, by the way, if you see anything that needs doing around here, do it. You know, don't think somebody else will do it. We're trying to establish things. And so that kept on in my mind. And in the winter of 1972-73, as I worked away at making flower jewelry, I realized nobody here had way to buy food, and many people didn't have a car. We shared vehicles, and so town, 15 miles, that was a long way. To go to town was an outing. That was a big deal. And so food. And what started happening, because in 72, 73, there were probably about 100 people living here from my recollection. And people were really getting established. But what started happening is, because there wasn't a place to buy food, Asha was running the retreat kitchen, and people started buying food from her. And that lasted a couple of months, and then it was like, it was crazy. And so I thought, well, I go down from the meditation retreat, which is where I stayed the first 9 months I was here. I go every day to the farm. Maybe I can do a little something. So I thought, at least I can go and buy a box of fruit, you know, say maybe some bananas and oranges or something like that. And this is the way things happened in those days. I commandeered one of the very small rooms in the farmhouse, because anything that was covered and dry and had any aspect of warmth to it was high premium. You know, you really had to go for it. So anyway, I took that little place, and it's what's used for the downstairs market office today. But that's where it started. And so I bought a couple boxes of fruit, and I would do my job in the morning, and then at lunchtime, when people were starving, then I'd go into that little room, and I'd sell stuff, just, some way. Money, a lot of people didn't carry money, and so we'd just make it work somehow. And, Divine Mother thought this was a good idea, because I was thinking of it more, well, I'll just do a little something. And then this young man came. His name was Sanjaya. He's no longer here. He didn't stay very long, but he was really into markets and food and produce. And he said, I have $500. And in those days, it was like, if you had money and you gave it, it was a donation. And you didn't get a receipt for it either. You just gave it. Anyway, he was very generous, and he gave $500, which was a huge amount of money. I started the market. I didn't have any money to put into it. I just figured it would work out. That was Swami's energy. If you put out the energy, then it'll work out. And so he came, and we were able to, right at that time, things were shifting in the farmhouse, and the print shop, which had been all the downstairs, moved up to the new publications building. And right when that happened, again, real estate became available, those little rooms. And one of the rooms we were able to get, we kept the other one. You know, you never give up anything. So we kept the other one, and we had this little room, which is where the produce is today. And that was the market. And it was wonderful because we built some shelves with $500. Wow, we bought food. We bought a produce case, which we didn't have room for inside, so we put it out on the porch, and we bought a little ice cream freezer. You know, we just did what we could do to keep energy moving and to expand what we could offer people. So we had shelves. We were an outlet for the Ananda dairy, which was happening then. We sold produce from the garden, and we also, Sanjaya was very into produce. So he would go down to Winters and buy lugs of fruit that he would bring back for canning, because people here did canning. And so again, it was a place for, and in my mind, as we started it, I saw the market as a community center. Again, what Jyotish was talking about there, we were establishing things that would draw things together. There was absolutely no place to sit down except in the mud or the dirt around the whole market area. There was nothing. And so for a while, the center room was a lounge. It was dry, it was warm, there was an old couch in there, and there was a wood stove. And then after that evolved a while, the market also moved into that area, but it provided a way for people to see each other. Otherwise, we were out working in all these different areas, really working hard. And it was hard work because it was so physical. You know, there were all these things that needed to be done. And so with the market, people could come there. Not only could they get food, but they could see each other. So a lot of important conversations happened in the market, you know, where people, oh yes, and I've been meaning to. We had one phone, you know, that was right there in the market. But also, in addition to it being that kind of a social environment, which was really important at the time, really needed so people could see each other and connect, I also personally saw it as the greatest vehicle for doing the teachings. Because Swami was talking to us about all the right attitudes and meditation and all of that. Well, work was the place to experiment with all of that. And so I had little things happen where, you know, the phone being right there, that was the one place where everybody could reach anyone in the entire downtown farm area. It was a big area, not just the market, the fields, you know, wherever people happened to be. And so the phone would ring and I'd think, no, I don't want to answer the phone, you know, because somebody's going to want somebody out there. And so anyway, but then I, you know, was thinking, okay, let's get into the right attitude. And so it was like every time the phone rang, I picked it up, answered it, did whatever needed to happen. It was about energy. And I always felt during those years that Swami, in addition to giving us all the basics of the spiritual path, of yoga, of Master's teachings, he also worked tremendously with our energy. And it was about free-flowing, just serving, just doing, and really keeping it going in the right direction, but keeping it going, not just sitting back and thinking someone else will do this or that. But no, we would flow a lot. You know, we talk about Dwapara Yuga. Well, if something really needed to happen, you're out of the market and doing it over here because it needed to happen. So we just flowed a lot. But even so, each of us in various areas, and the market being a prime one, set a pattern and set a stability for I can get food at the farm. So, and the market was very successful. Swami, little by little, I was able to, in the next year or so, hire one or two people, and it just kind of kept evolving from there. But as Jyotish said, none of it would have happened if we hadn't been deeply committed to this path and allowed Master's grace through Swami to flow through us as well as willing channels. The other aspect of the thing that I was involved in was the monastery. Now that didn't happen for me personally for a few years, but the monastery started around 1972 and went for, at that time, high gear, probably, 15 years, 1985 or beyond. And it's still in existence today, having gone through a lot of changes and come back again and that kind of thing. But for me at that time, the monastery made the most sense. When I came here, I was in a relationship, and that ended a year or two after I came. And I remember going to Swami and just saying, but everything that you're saying, I don't see any other option but to be a complete renunciate. Of course I'd want to give my life to that. And so as soon as that way, he said, just wait, the time will come. And as soon as that time came, then I moved there. And I was involved with the monastery for about 10 years. And so 7 of those years were here at the village, 3 of them were out serving in the Bay Area, San Francisco, things like that. But the monastery for me, again, it provided a way for people to really ground their lives spiritually. We had a lot of single people here, men and women, and the men lived down around Swami's house. Women lived up above in the area that's cleared out up above there. And we kept very separate. And Swami told us all about what he had experienced as a monk and how to live that kind of life. And we tried. We did it. And it was wonderful. I was going to say, for me personally, I felt absolutely free. You know, you go through phases in your life, but free from what? Inwardly free. When you live in that consciousness, and I'd say that's what I lived in that consciousness, and we had a lot of contact with Swami because we were right there, and if he needed things to happen or if he was having a tea or something, we could easily be involved in that. But the consciousness of freedom, inner freedom, was really very particular and strong. And I think it's because when you live as a renunciate and you live separately, men and women, you're not in duality as much. You know, you're really living with other people. I felt, and Swami would often say this to us, don't think of yourself as a man or a woman. Don't think of your age. Don't think of all the limiting things, but really be a soul seeking God. And I felt that the monastery really gave that, and that lifestyle gave that ability to deeply experience that. For me, it was a tremendously grounding spiritual time, and very full of joy. If it's not about joy, it shouldn't be happening for you. But it was very joyful, and people that I lived with, meditated with, worked with, served with, played with, everything, are still deep friends 40 years later. So, and it works in every aspect. That was the monastery. It works in every aspect of life that you do that in. But with the monastery, what I would say about it in particular is I would wish everyone that as they come on the spiritual path would have that time of inner freedom and ability to live less in duality. And in fact, Swami often said, for the first year you're here, don't get in a relationship. Really live, without those complications, because it takes a lot of strength to live in a relationship. First of all, living as a monastic, you really get to know yourself, so, which is vital for a deep spiritual life. So hopefully that will, and with the monks right now and the nuns, it's starting to come back. We really had to focus on other aspects of the community and married couples and children and schools, which you'll hear about. That had to happen. But the monastery, to me, it was like a forest ashram in India. All we didn't have buildings, we just had Swami's dome, and then the rest of us lived in trucks and teepees and trailers and all kinds of things. But none of that really mattered. I thought it was great. Lived in it for a long time. But that way of life gives you an experience that you'll never forget. And I would highly recommend it to anyone who can possibly do it, because without that, life comes in, and it can be very hard to keep your spiritual life really together. But with that, it's wonderful. Anyway, the monastery was a wonderful time for me. I hope it can be a blessing for all of you in various ways. So, thank you.
Good morning, and for those who don't know me, my name is Swami Sadhana Devi. So it's nice to be here with you. And I came here in 1969, and I would like to tell you some stories about some of the businesses rather than go through the details of the businesses themselves. Swami started, I suppose you would say Swami started the first business with the retreat. And when I came, we became the retreat staff, those of us who were there kind of on work exchange. There were about 10 of us. Swami gave all of the programs when he came twice a month, morning through night, except he didn't do the morning and afternoon sadhana. That was done by Satya, who is the retreat master. Satya is the only person I've ever met who could lead yoga postures while he was in silence. He managed to do it. We did it out on the deck, which went around the dome that was there at the time. And he would move from one posture to another, and each time he would rap on the floor with his knuckles. And we knew, okay, or we opened our eyes from time to time because we could kind of sense it was time to move. I don't know what he did for meditation. I can't remember. Maybe he just went in and sat down and meditated, probably, something like that. But anyway, that was our very first business. Then I think we would say that Jyotish took over after those first things happened. Then Jyotish's business he went to San Francisco and he learned how to make incense. Well, he came back and he started the business, and I just thought I'd tell you a little story about, there was one man who worked there whose name was Bimal. And Bimal was in charge of making the stuff that goes on, goes on to the incense sticks. You know, it's not just a stick. It has some stuff on it. Jyotish came up with a new recipe. His recipe, I'm not sure what all of it was, but it was charcoal and something gooey and sticky. I'm not sure what it was. And Bimal's job was to mix this stuff up in a vat. And so Jyotish had to invent everything along the way here. So there was no kind of mixer that they could find that worked. And they started off with a hand mixer like you used to make a cake or something, and that lasted about probably 10 minutes, or not too long. They broke one after another. Finally, they made a contraption. I was just thinking, this reminds me of what farmers do. If you know a farmer and you go onto his property, you will find somewhere, if not in a shed, out in the property, a bunch of parts that are been collected over the decades that go, whenever something breaks, it goes there, looks for a part. Well, that was kind of what they did for the mixer. And so it was some kind of deal like that. And so Bimal's job was to mix up the stuff. And then his next job was to dip the sticks. Then he was supposed to dip the sticks again in the scent. So Bimal came in the mornings and he mixed the stuff up. Sometimes it was kind of frozen or close to it. But he got it going. And he mixed the stuff up. Well, it splattered everywhere, all over the shop, all over the walls, everywhere, and especially all over Bimal. And so we would, kind of expect when we saw Bimal that maybe we might not recognize him because he might be covered with some black goo in some part of his body. So he would do that, and after he got that part done, then he would dip the sticks in the scent. We always knew when Bamal was around. We could always smell him. At least he smelled good. I don't know how many years Bamal did that. It seemed like it was a long time. But, Jaya and I went away to India, and we came back, and we were inquiring of some friends who live in the area if they knew if Bamal was still living here. They said, no, he passed away a few years ago. I think in heaven that Bamal is in a really nice place and that it's really, really clean. Well, another one of our businesses that turned out to be a little bit ill-fated was blackberries. Swami was always encouraging us to do things that would bring in income. And the hillsides were covered with blackberry bushes, much more than we have now. And he suggested, let's do the blackberries. Look at all those blackberries. Why don't you pick those and we can sell them? And so some people were interested and some people weren't, but we tried. And so someone here offered if we would pick the blackberries, they would take them down to the Bay Area or somewhere and sell them. So we got together, and he appointed Haridas as the cheerleader of all of this. So it seemed like every time we got together for any reason at all, Haridas was there with his little pep talk, got to pick those blackberries, And when he finished, he would always say, Hari Berry. It wasn't too long after that he got the new name of Haridas. Otherwise, he'd still be Hari Berry. So we picked the blackberries, and we gave them to the man, and he went away, and we never saw him again. Well, there were many other interesting and creative ways that we came up with to earn money. One was a candy shop developed by Ananda and Shivani. And the first thing they made were called Om bars, ground nuts and fruit, and in a bar. And they were really good, excellent, very, very tasty. Everybody loved them. And so Jaya and his friend were going to go on a hike on the Pacific Coast Trail. And so they decided, they were trying to figure out, okay, what food are we going to take? And they decided to take some Om bars. That was all they decided to take. 2 weeks of Om bars. They're really good at first, but 14 days, that's a lot of Om bars. They said by the time they finished their trek, they were trading Om bars for anything edible, and didn't care how much they hated it when they were at home. If it wasn't an Om bar, it was good. Well, toward the time that the fire started, later in that year, actually, no, I take that back. Earlier, I think in 72, perhaps, 72 maybe. We had some friends who lived in Auburn and were much more tuned in to what kind of work it might be available in this area. As you may know, Nevada County was suffering from an economic depression when we came here, and many of the stores on Commercial Street in town were boarded up, just out of business. So jobs around here were pretty scarce, especially if you didn't have any particular skills that were relevant to this area. And so this family that we knew that lived in Auburn, they really loved what we were doing. Their daughter went to our high school, and their son was also here too. And so the dad, the father, Mr. Apt, his name was, suggested that maybe we could get a contract with the Forest Service where we could plant trees for them. Sounded like a nice thing, kind of like gardening on a large scale. And so everybody said, that sounds like a great idea. Let's see what we can do. So they got a contract, and they started off with about 6 or 8 guys. And in that time, they went off to a place called Happy Camp, which was, well, could have been accurate or not. We don't know. But they were there, and they camped out beside a creek. They took Shivani along with them, who cooked. And they had a tiny trailer for the kitchen, and she cooked, and they went off and they worked, and they didn't know this when they started, but they got paid by the piece. This is always risky when you're just beginning to do something, to get paid by the piece, because usually you hardly ever make enough money to even break even. And that, of course, that's what happened. But it was really good for them, very good for them, because they learned how to do this. And for many years after that, that was one source of income for us. And we didn't just barely break even. Sometimes there was enough money left over to do things with, or to support the people who actually did it. And so, so I actually wanted to read to you a little bit. By the way, people have said to me many times, you know about some of this stuff. You were here at the beginning. Why don't you write a book? Well, I wrote 2 books. This is what one of them looks like. But they're both now on the web. And when you leave today, please take these 2 bookmarks, which say on them the link to the website where they are. And if you'd like to know more about Ananda history, there's a whole lot of it on there. These stories and lots of others. Now it's because it's on a website, now it's open to more stories. So if you have stories to tell, if you have pictures, there's lots of pictures on there now. If you have pictures that you would let me borrow and scan and put on that website, please let me know. This is a living history kind of a thing. We're not, it's no longer sort of static in a book. So I hope that you will contribute and add your perspectives and your stories to this. But I would also like to read what Jaya wrote about in this book about this place, Happy Camp. In the end, Happy Camp turned out to be a financial bust. We each made a pittance for our labor. But in the long run, it was a wonderful opportunity for working together under conditions of great adversity. Although physically stretched to our core, we developed a bond with one another that is unique to groups who face the challenge. In the midst of everything, we meditated, chanted, sang, joked, and shared our adventure together as a community. Through humor and camaraderie, we turned what could have been bitter into a shared sweetness, and indeed an experience from which we learned a lot. In subsequent years, once we had navigated the ropes of contracting with skill and proper equipment, planting in the winter and tree thinning in the summer became an important source of income for community members. For 2 and 3 weeks at a time, groups of young men would travel to remote locations in the mountains of California and Oregon, camping and working as a team. We approached everything cooperatively, sharing all risks, responsibilities, losses, and rewards equally. Out of this came teamwork and habits of mutual trust, friendship, and cooperation, all things upon which a community is built, that were used to build Ananda in subsequent years. Years later, one had only to say the words Happy Camp to another who had shared that adventure to receive in return a knowing smile.
So for those of you who don't know me, my name's Nitai, and spent most of my time at the village children of various ages. I'll talk to you about the beginnings this morning. Teamwork. So I arrived to live here in the summer of 1972. I had a minor background. I had just gotten a teaching credential, actually, at UC Davis. So that, when moving up here, that made me, it was the equivalent of having 40 years of experience anywhere else. Not just in education, actually in everything. I remember we were building what became Aspen building, the first, and it was kind of half completed by volunteer labor, and like, it was like you look at the walls, and the wall line would kind of go like this, and nobody knew that you were supposed to do walls straight. This man came who was a journeyman carpenter. Everybody got so excited that we had a journeyman carpenter that could go and straighten out these things. So it was very much of a beginning time on many levels. I wanted to just try to put it in a context a little bit. So I first moved up to Retreat, which is where pretty much everybody who was committed to these deeper ideals of Ananda lived at that time. This is the summer of 72, the fall of 72. And it became clear that since I was going to be working with the kids who were all down at the village, I should move down to the village and that fall. Well, when I announced that up at the retreat, I got this shocked response from people. I remember Asha saying to me, "You're moving to the village?" And it was like, you're moving to the hell or some kind of... Because the vibrations were really different. Jyotish was kind of commenting on some of the things. I mean, the chanting Om people who could chant Om for 3 times lived at the village. And they were wonderful people, but they were really not that much interested in the spiritual path. So, but that's where the kids were, so I moved down. And so then I decided that, well, I'd like to go to Sunday service, because Swami gave all the Sunday services up at the retreat. And I didn't have a car at that time. Well, there were, I don't know, maybe there were 70, 80 people living at the village at that time. I had 2 choices for a ride on Sundays, because only 2 people went up to Sunday service. One was Jyotish, and the other was Kalyani, the lady I married a few years later. And that was it. If I did, otherwise I had to walk, because nobody else was interested in, it's kind of hard to imagine, nobody else was interested in going up to hear Swami talk. It was just not a priority. So that was kind of the world that I came into. The children were an essential part of creating a spiritual community. Obviously, Master wanted this to happen. There were monasteries, there were convents that, I don't know about the convent side, but I know the monastery side can get pretty serious. You get a bunch of guys living together, and it's kind of like things get kind of stern. And what happens when you bring children around is that shatters that. It's just, there's this whole other energy that comes in, which is overall very helpful to just kind of the spiritual breadth of any enterprise. But there were some challenges, partly because we were kind of in the crossroads of 2 kind of cultural movements. People who lived in the rural areas in the United States, since it got founded, the children were very much involved. They would, from the time you were old enough to milk cows, you were out there, you had chores to do, you had jobs to do and things. And there was that tradition. But you also had this tradition that had happened in the 60s, which was this revolt against all these values. And so you had these parents who, the basic theme was, don't tell your children to do anything. Just leave them alone, no discipline at all. So you had these 2 things come together. You had people out in the country raising kids, but the kids had no role in the lifestyle. There was nothing they were supposed to do, nothing they were asked to do. So what do you think happened? Those of you who grew up in that area, there was this story that was common there called Lord of the Flies. They kind of captured the essence. Because the kids had no direction. When I arrived, there was a woman who was coming out from town once or twice a week to work with the kids, and that was a semblance of something started. As soon as she found out that I was there and was willing to work with the kids, somehow she disappeared really fast. And so we had this situation. Okay, well, what do you do? What do you do within this area building the community? There were no guidelines. I guess it was symbolized by the fact that First of all, we were giving a building. We were given, all of you know, we were given the last remaining chicken coop at Ananda. Everything else had been transferred into a home or a business by that time, but there was this one chicken coop that was still left. If you're down at the market and you're standing in front of the mailroom and you're where the fountain is, that's where the chicken coop was. And you kind of wonder, why was that chicken coop left? Well, that had the deepest layers of chicken manure in it of any of the other buildings, and nobody had been willing to shovel it out before that point. So we got rid of the chicken manure, and we put in of course, the walls, huge gaps in the walls, all kinds of light come through, and of course, when the fall came, the wind would come through. So we had these sheets of plastic that we stapled up, and of course, they would flap in the breeze. And heating it there was a little stove somebody gave us, but it was, you couldn't even you sitting on it wouldn't have kept you warm. So there were all kinds of challenges on that point. Seva, who was the financial guardian of the community at that point, she assured me that there was a budget for the school and that I could use, and it was $50 a month, and that and it included my salary. So the advantage was that, I was new to teaching, so I didn't have a whole lot of preconceptions, and here was this opportunity. The children, none of the children had ever gone to school before. They were here. They were hippie kids, and they just been hanging out. So, first I had this bell. I got this bell, and I thought, well, we'll ring a bell to start school. So I rang the bell, and the kids came, but they just wanted to ring the bell. They just didn't. So there was no sense of you should show up for school, or if you did show up, that you needed to stay there any longer than you really wanted to. So it was pretty much chaotic. And after about 2 weeks, I closed the school, and and there was this gasp throughout the community because yet one more effort was going to stumble. But I just closed the school because I wanted to set up some kind of a pattern. So I said, okay, we'll reopen the school, but before we come back, I need to interview everybody. Everybody needs to come in and talk to me and tell me that you really want to do this. And I can tell you what it means to want to do this. So it means that you want to show up, at 9 o'clock in the morning, whenever we started. You stay until 2 o'clock. And we're Monday through Friday. And so I got enough people to say yes to that. So we started. We had six children. Youngest was 4. The oldest was 8. Again, it was so hard to get across how hard it was to live here, even for single people. I mean, Davy lived in a treehouse at one point. Todd and Davy was putting up teepees for shelter. So single people had a really rough time. So think of trying to raise a family in that setting. It was basically impossible. And so the turnover rate for families was high because people would try it. Also, we were all brand new to the spiritual life, and I know I came as a single person and joined the monastery, and so I had this structure that Parvati was talking about to try to figure out what the heck this spiritual life was. But if you're trying to raise kids and earn a living, support a family, you didn't have that time, so it was really difficult. I still remember the first couple that actually came here and didn't get divorced or leave within 2 years. And I was on the membership committee at that point, and this fine young couple came in. They had 2 kids. They had 2 older kids, and they sat down. And I'm interviewing them, and I'm going, "Oh, darn! It's too bad you had to come now because your marriage isn't going to last." I didn't say this out loud. I'm done thinking about them. They think, oh, poor people. They'll be gone in a year and a half, and their lives will be. And it was Durga and Vidura. So they managed to break the mold. And then other people started getting married here. Jaya and Sadhana, Jyotish and Devi, and other people started to come, and the householder thing started to get some traction, but it didn't have traction in those days. So the other part of it, of course, was what kind of a school you're supposed to have. Well, we're a spiritual community. You're supposed to have a spiritual school. What's that mean? Well, the only thing I knew was that what it wasn't supposed to be, because I was raised as a Catholic. My mother put me through 8 years of Catholic grammar school. And everything that happened to me there, I knew shouldn't happen here. But that left a lot of space. So I remember going to Swami fairly early on and saying, okay, what's supposed to happen? And I think first thing I said, maybe I should go get some more training. Maybe I should go study Montessori schools or Rudolf Steiner schools. Or maybe I should go to Ranchi. I'd read about Ranchi, an autobiography of Yogi. So first thing he says, Nitai, there's nothing to learn at Ranchi. And I didn't realize the depth of that until I got to go there a few years later and visit and realized it had really deteriorated since Master was there. It was actually some of the worst teaching I've ever seen in my whole life. And they closed the school. And I think they might have started over again. I don't know. But then he said about Montessori and Steiner, he said, that's not where you're going to get your inspiration. You have to learn to get it from inside. And so, okay. But he did show me his priceless set of magazines that he'd collected, all the old SRF magazines from the 1920s and beyond. And he said, come over anytime and just read through. Maybe you can find things that Master wrote about it. So I did that. I started to come over in the afternoons and found two articles in the things. One was called The Psychological Chart, which was something Master had written in 1918 or 19 when he was teaching in India. And then another thing was an article called A Balanced Life, which there's a version of it in Man's Eternal Quest, but it's a truncated version that just chopped off the part that really detailed what he was talking about for the schools. But I had the original. I had the original from before. And they gave me a little of an outline. Master talked in terms of different parts of the child, the physical part, the mental part, the intellectual part. All these things were precursors to what Swami put together later on in Education for Life. So I did have a little bit of a roadmap. And the first thing that I remember, most of you have heard a lot of these stories, so I will tell them as well as I can. I thought the first thing I realized that storytelling works with kids. And so the best story I could find was the Ramayana, because it's this great Indian epic, which was new to me, and I was really excited about it. And so I had to found a children's version of it, and I would, the day before, I would read the next chapter and take a few notes, and I'd come in and I'd tell the kids the story. It worked incredibly well. That more than anything was motivating the kids to come in the morning, because I told the story right at 9 o'clock, and if they got there late, they missed the story. So, so that worked out really well. But then it was so educational on another level. I got, they were little kids, and so when we got to big words, I would ask them, make sure we were on the same page. So one of the scenes is Hanuman shoots through the sky like a meteor. If you know the story, Hanuman's jumping. Hanuman's the monkey god, and he's jumping from India to Sri Lanka. And he shoots through the sky like a meteor. So I stopped and I said, okay, meteor is a big word. So who knows what meteor is? And so one person raised their hand. I said, okay, what's a meteor? He said, well, it's somebody that eats hamburgers. So we stopped, and I had the same chuckle you just had, and I just, okay. I said, well, no, Hanuman didn't have a hamburger in his mouth when he was jumping. It means something. I told him what it meant. So 2 minutes later, Rama is walking through the forest, and he comes through an ashram, and there's a man sitting there in samadhi. So I said, okay, all right, samadhi. Okay, another big word. Who knows what samadhi means? Well, my youngest child, her name was Nicole. She's 4 years old. And Nicole raises her hand. And she says, I know what samadhi is. Okay, I'm ready for the next laugh. And I said, okay, so Nicole, what's samadhi? And she says, well, it's when you're sitting there and you're really still, and somebody comes up to you and they say, Nicole, Nicole, and there's nobody there to answer. And I just all this big change in me went, that learning the fact that I wasn't working with kids, I was working with souls. And some of these souls had a lot more on the ball than I did. And I had to be open to those moments when they were willing to share those insights. So anyway, we moved along that way. And I was learning, they were learning, we moved up the hill, we got out of the chicken coop actually. We were only in chicken coop about 3 months. When end of November came, it was like, even though the new building wasn't finished, we moved up there because it was better than the original one. Then we got the next kind of my lesson, which was that Divine Mother really was protecting us, and Master was really behind us and wanting this thing to happen. Because we got to this point where we needed divine assistance. And so we're up there. It's on the school building's on the hill. There was no road there in those days. There was this old tractor trail that came clumping down from the top of the hill there. And one day the kids start jumping up and yelling all excited. And I said, "What's going on?" It says, "A car's coming, a car's coming." So I go out, and sure enough, there's this car, and on the side of it, it says State of California, and this clomp, 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 clomp. I get down next to the building, and this man gets up, very serious-looking man, and he had this clipboard, and he gets up, and I said, "Hi," and he says, "Hi, you got a school here?" And I says, yeah, we're starting a school. And he says, "Well, I'm from the State Fire Marshal. I heard you guys were doing this, and I wanted you to know that you've got to have a good fire access for this school in case in case you have a fire. We have to protect these kids." And I says, "Oh yeah, that'd be a good idea." And he says, then he read me says section 3.4-2 says you have to have a paved road up to your schoolhouse. And my mouth dropped. And I said, "A paved road?" Because that's from there to Tyler Foot. I don't know. If you snake around the hills at least half a mile or more. And I said, "What do you think that would cost?" He says, "Well, probably not more than $1 million." And so I'm thinking about the $50 a month budget I've got. And I told him, I said, "I don't know if we can do that." And he says, "Well, if you can't do that, I'll be back in 2 weeks. If you don't have significant progress in this direction, we'll have to shut you down." So he left, and sitting there, I think, well, what do you do with that? You got $50 a month versus $1 million. So I did enough research to find out that we could have bought our own fire truck for less than $500,000. We could have just parked it next to the school, but the fire truck itself was going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. So there wasn't anything I could do. So I just did what Swami had been telling us. This is what this period was all about for all of us, learning to put these principles into action, that they're not just theory, they're not just these nice things you read in the scripture, but they have to work in real life. So I just said, okay, I can't deal with this. There's nothing I can do. Master, this is yours. And I put it in his lap, and then the next 2 weeks, the kids and I just kept doing what we were doing, and we didn't think about it. 2 weeks later, clunk, 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 here comes the car down the hill again, same car. But there's a different man in the car. And the man gets out, and he smiled when he got out. And I thought, oh, this is encouraging. I don't think he even had a clipboard, if I remember. And he just looked around, and he kind of had this smile. And so he looked around. I said, "Oh, you got a nice school out here." And I said, "Yeah." He says, "Yeah, well, I'm from the State Fire Marshal." And I said, "Oh," I said, "What happened to the other guy?" And he says, "Oh, he had an opportunity to get into arson investigation." And I thought, yeah, that fit him. And he says, "Well, let's see. You got if you have a fire here, you got a lot of space around the school." He says, "Basically, you just need to be able to get the kids out of the building." And I said, "Yeah, that makes sense." And he looked around and he said, "You need a fire alarm system of some sort." He looked at me and he said, "Do you have a whistle?" And I just inwardly, I'm thanking Master, and I'm thinking, we can afford a whistle, yeah. And so we got our whistle. He signed us off, and that was it. And the school went on. So I do have to, I would just spend one more minute, I know. You set the tone, British, I'm sorry. We all got sworn to be here 15 minutes or get our throats cut. But So 2 other times in my history with the school, we had similar situations. I won't tell the whole stories, but the high school was the point where we were getting accredited. And the accreditation team came out. And here we are, this is much later, this is like 1999 or something like that. But we still look kind of funky compared to most high schools, and our curriculums are really different, and all kinds of things are different. And this man comes out, and he's very dour, and I'm trying to talk to him, get him some kind of communication with him. And it turns out, I'm asking him what his background was, and he'd been a principal in Sacramento. And I said, "Oh, what's high school?" It turns out it was this Miraloma High School. And I said, my mom used to work there. And he says, what's your mom's name? And I told him, Daphne Johnson. And he says, Daphne? Daphne? And he got really excited. He said, she was the best person I ever worked with. And from then on, we were in. So then I just had another one a couple of weeks ago, actually, because the college, we're getting the college off the ground. And so we were moving to a new location, and we had to be approved by the state of Oregon. And I talked to the guy on the phone, and he was like, there was these long pauses in the phone. I'd try to tell him what we're doing, and he would just stop. And I had to say this one, are you still there? He says, yes. Because I'm telling you, we don't, we're traveling around the globe, basically. We're based in Oregon for 4 months, and we're going to India, then we're going to Italy, and this is we're doing in college. And he was just, and so I'm really concerned about him coming out to do a site visit. But I just remember those other two stories. I put it in Master's hand. He arrives, and he's a different person when you're physically talking to him. He's one of these people who doesn't do telephones very well, I guess. I don't know. But he gets out of the car, he looks around, he shakes my hand, he smiles, and he got all excited about what we were doing. He just signed us off, and again, so anyway, grace is still with us.
Everyone, my name is Durga. My husband and I, as you heard from Nitai, came here in 1974 with our two children. Dwayne was 11, Melissa was 8. And I was thinking, I've been putting together this slideshow. I call it the new old slideshow of the early years of Ananda. And one thing that was interesting to me is there's these pictures of Ananda in the very, very early stages when we first bought. We called it the farm back then, and usually you can tell how long people have been here when they say, I'm going to the farm or I'm going to the village. And so it was the farm back then, and you can really get a feel for what it was like back then, because everybody's sitting in the dirt, they're playing in the dirt, they're doing volleyball in the dirt, they're watching movies in the dirt, everything happened in the dirt. And I was just, I thought, yeah, that's exactly the way it was. And I was thinking about when we came here, and both Vidura and I, we all lived up at the retreat in a tent with our son. Our daughter was away. And we lived up there on Sunset Boulevard for 3 months in a tent. And Vidura, I was thinking of this too. Here I am looking at these slideshows. Here's a picture of Vidura masticking this meditation dome, which is like a substance that keeps the leaks from happening. And just Friday, he was up on a roof, fixing the roof from leaking. And so I thought, wow, we've really come full circle. So the first job that I had when I came here was working in the office at the meditation retreat, and here I am. What is the lesson in that? I don't know. But I think there's a little more consciousness behind it than there was back then. But I have a couple stories I want to share about that time. At some point, Leela and I were both working in the office together, and Vidura tells this story way better than I do because he's good at enhancing things. But basically, it's true. We would come, and you have to understand there was no phone up there. So the only way we would know if people were coming is by a note. And it would come up with somebody coming up to the meditation retreat if someone was coming up to the meditation retreat. So we would get this little note, and it would either say, so-and-so is coming today or coming in a couple of weeks, and we keep very careful notes. Because I think it was one of these great speakers was saying there was two phones in the community, one down at the farm, one at the market, and one up at the publications building. So the reservations would come to the publications building, and then we'd get a note. So I remember this one time, Leela and I were expecting this man to come, and you have to understand the buildings they're a little rustic now, but they were really rustic back then. And the main thing we had were tents, and they were on platforms, but most of the platforms had big holes in them. And the tents were pretty nice, actually. I remember staying in one when I first came. And I thought, oh, this is nice. There's 2 little cots and a lantern. And so that, to me, was great. And but this man came, and he was late. And so we waited and waited for him. And he came, and he was dressed in a suit. And not only a suit, but he had these really nice shoes with, polished. And I just sort of looked at Leela, and I thought, okay, who's going to take him to his tent? You or I don't know. So I think I got to do it. And he never said a word. And I walked him to his tent, and I said, oh, be careful, there's a little hole there. And I got him into the tent, but when we went to see if he was okay in the morning, he had already gone. So people didn't really know what we had to offer, except a lot of joy and willingness to do and make their lives as nice as we could. One of the things Vidura was telling me about was one of the first jobs he had, besides masticing the dome, was digging outhouse holes with Prakash. And he said the way they would do it is they would start digging, and they would dig, and they would dig, and then they'd get far enough down that one person would go down in the hole, and the holes were had to be 10 feet deep. So one of them would go down, and then they'd start, digging up the dirt, and would put in a bucket, and up it went, and they would do that all the way until they got 10 feet deep. And that's the way we had our outhouse. That's all we had were outhouses. And so that was one of his jobs. Then we got to, Vidura came to me one day and said, I heard there's a job down at the farm. Go see if you can get it. And so I said, okay. And so I went down, and I met Shiva. Those of you remember Shiva. Parvati was with Shiva, and he was a lovely soul. He was my boss. And I saw him at the market, and I said, is there a job? He said, yeah, there's a job. You want it? And I said, yeah. So that's how we got jobs back then. And so I went over, and it was in the macrame shop. Well, again, Jyotish had somehow discovered that there was money to be made in macrame. And so if you remember, and it's still going on today, the macrame plant holders, there's these lovely 3 strings, and sometimes they're more ornate than others, and some have beads and some are plain, and we had 10 different styles, 3011, 30212. And so my job was to put them together. And I remember we had the macrame shop. You'll see photos tonight. It was a great building. It was called the Cathedral Building. So it was this very cathedral-looking like building, but it was just the struts and plastic all around it. And then it was next to the old barn, which was similar to the one you see as you drive to Ananda on the left. It was very similar to that. And so that was we called it the old barn, and then the macrame shop, and I got to work in the macrame shop. It's still one of my very favorite jobs of all times. Seva cut it really short for me, but I'll tell you that story in a minute. So anyway, I got to work, and I would go over to the big barn, the old barn, and somebody had made this big, did you make this big wheel? As a wheel, and it had these struts that stuck out of it, and you wrap the what's that stuff called? Jute. You'd wrap the jute around it, and you'd spin this wheel, and so I'd be over there spinning the wheel. It was like heaven. And so I'm just doing this, and then you'd cut it about this long. And you take it back into the cathedral building, and you put together these little kits. And it was a great business especially for housewives. They could do it at home. They could be there with their kids, and it was a way for them to make money. Now, I remember being on the market lawn. We say the market lawn, but there was no lawn. It was dirt. And so we were out on the market dirt, and Jyotish came, and he said he was all excited because we were going to make $2 an hour, which was a big deal back then. And I think people actually did. I remember some people being very fast at doing this. So you would get paid by the piece. So the more you could do, the more money you would make. Well, you've heard this probably before, but one of my favorite things about working there is at that point, we had a house. I may not tell that story. I may not have time. But anyway, we had this house up on the hill where Raniket is now. And I would walk to work. In the summertime, I would love to walk to work barefooted because there was this dirt about this thick, about this deep, and it was just soft. It was so dry here, you know, it was just like sand, but real, real soft. And you would walk in and it was this amazing feeling. And I would just be like I was just floating. And you can't imagine. You know, I was thinking, where did we come from? Why did we come here? You know, because another thing that's similar is that we came here because of us. We met Swamiji, but there was a little slideshow that I think it was Keshav and Ananda were showing at one of these Meeting of the Ways we had back then. And it was a slideshow, and here I am doing the slideshow so other people can see Ananda. But there wasn't anything here. There wasn't anything really to show except land and these little tiny retreat buildings. And I don't know, but what drew people here and why people stay is this exactly why those of you that have come later, you come here and you stay. You don't come here for the buildings. You don't come here for anything except the spirit of what's here. And that's what drew us, and that's why we're still here today. So I went to the macrame shop, and at one point I got a call, and I worked there, I think, from September to about March. And we would be working in the building in the wintertime with the snow coming down. There was no plastic anymore. So the snow would come through the slats down in what we were working on. It was like heaven. And so, and we had, Dave, you'll remember this, all the women back then, we had these boots they called bean boots. We got them from LL Bean. They were these great big boots. And then we wore long skirts and these big boots. And we wore them everywhere, even in the dirt, in the mud. And so I remember walking to work. And then I got this call. And so what happened is you get a message probably from Parvati saying you have a phone call. Well, nobody ever called me. Who could call me? You can't find me. But at the market, they had a little hole in the side of the building and with a platform, and the red phone was there. And you could access the red phone from outside or inside. And so you get the call, the red phone, and you go to the red phone, you pick it up. And it was a regular phone, you know, with a top on it. And so you pick it up, and it was Seva. And Seva says, we have a job opening at the print shop, and we were thinking you might be good for the job. I said, no, I really like the job I have now. I really, thank you very much. I hung up, and I went back to work. So about, I don't know, maybe it was a day or two, maybe it's a week, I got another phone call. It was Seva. And Seva says, you know, I was talking to Swamiji, and he thought it was a really good idea that that you work in the print shop. I said, oh, that's really nice, but I really love my job. And thank you very much. So I hung up and I went back, but this time with a little uneasy feeling in there. And Benai was one of my bosses in Shiva, and I went to both of them. They wouldn't say a word. They would not tell me anything. So I just went home and I meditated, and the tears were coming down my face. I didn't know what I should do. You know, should I, assert my will? Is that what I'm supposed to do? Or am I supposed to say yes to whatever comes my way? Well, the yes won. And I went up to the print shop. Padma was up there working. And most people either worked up, we call Pubble, which is now Hansa Mandir, or in the gardens or in an individual business. So there are a lot of people up there. And I never did a very good job in the print shop, I must say. But I did it. And just to tell you where the print shop was, where the foyer is now at Hansa, and a little bit in from that was the print shop. And you'll see pictures tonight. It's unbelievable. Big printing presses in there. And they printed all Swamiji's books, except this one book they weren't able to get to, and it was Christmas Eve, and it was 1975 or 6, I'm not sure which. And I think 75, Swami had written stories of Mukunda. And he really, at that time, he always gave a book out for Christmas to everybody in the community. It was this Christmas present. But there was no way to do it. So we had this little tiny press called a Gestetner. It was like a mimeograph. And so we decided that we were going to print the book on this little press. So my daughter Melissa and I, we printed that book late into the night, Christmas Eve. and round and around and around that little press went, and it was so sweet. And we had people in the main part of the building. There were 3 floors to it. The bottom floor, the floor where the temple is now, and then another floor on top. And people were in there, and so we would get the finished pages, and we would send them in there, and they would cut them, and they would bind them. We bound the book with blue tape. Sava still has hers. Mine burned up in the fire, but she tried to give it to me, but I couldn't do it. But it's just so sweet just to be able to do that for Swamiji. It was always a very big blessing to be able to help him out in some way for all he'd given to us. He often would say, I know we were all up in the astral world and we're saying, okay, let's all go down and start community. And he just led us here to help us, support us, to do everything to help us on the way. I had a couple other things I wanted to share about children. It was a very free time, and free in maybe not so great ways, but also free in, I just remember all those things, walking, the things I was telling you about, just a feeling of freedom. And maybe it's from where we came from. Life was either very conservative or, the flower children were big at that time. We had come from that whole world. And being here away from drugs, but still that expansive feeling, because what Fatura and I wanted was not something just for ourselves. We wanted something that could help other people, and coming to Ananda was definitely that. But I have also stories about our children that I remember that were sort of embodies the spirit of freedom. One is, I didn't even know this till I put together the slideshow, but there's a picture of Dwayne and Melissa from the back. They're going along one of the old roads, and Dwayne's on top of this huge barrel. I don't know if it had oil in it or water, huge barrel, but he's on top. And you know how you are in the circus, so he's on this barrel going down the road, and Melissa's running along beside of him. But the kids really had to figure out what to do, because we didn't have scouts, we didn't have clubs, we didn't have anything. They had to figure it out for themselves, but they were so creative, and they built this wonderful tree house that they used for years. Remember that tree house over by the school? And then this one story about Bara, and he at one point took the older boys, it was Dwayne and 2 friends of his that were about the same age, and he was trying to work with these kids, and they were into their teens now, they were a little bit rebellious. And so he's working with them in sharing nature. It hadn't really started yet, but he was figuring it all out. And so he wanted them to go on a 3-day quest. And he wanted them to act like Native Americans and find the food on the land and find shelter on the land and live on the land. I thought, this is a great idea for these kids, perfect for this age. Except that one of the things they did was raid the houses. So I would have conversation in the village would be, I bought these apples. I don't know what the heck happened to these apples. And so finally we figured out that the kids had decided that they would, act like that. So that was one of the things that was fun for them. And they did help out a lot in the community. Melissa worked with the goats for years. She milked goats. And Dwayne worked in the candy factory when he first got here. And they found ways to help and to serve. There's one more story I wanted to tell you. I can't remember what it is. So anyway, it was a beautiful time in our lives. And we did can hundreds of quarts of vegetables and fruit. It just seemed to be what we did. And if I talk next year, I will tell you a story about canning hundreds of quarts of fruit. Thank you all very much.
I have to say, one of the greatest blessings in my life is to have shared my life with all of you. And you represent a small handful of the people that were here, some no longer in this world, so some no longer on the path, some still trucking. But it's part of this, as Jyotish said at the beginning, part of the secret of Ananda's success was the grace of Master Swami's guidance, but then also the great souls, really remarkable people that came in the first couple of years, first 10 years. And I have to say, the people that are coming now, it's like the second wave of Master's children are coming now with that same spirit of, as you've heard expressed. And, you know, you just open your heart up to possibilities. And inwardly, I was so amused. Here's Parvati talking about, you know, selling these little oranges or bananas. And now Parvati's doing our International Janaka Foundation, raising, you know, large sums of money to keep Ananda going. And Nitai started in the chicken coop, now traveling all over the world, disseminating the teachings about education for life, which evolved. Sadhana Devi, just doing whatever needed to be done. But, you know, I have to share something about sadhana that I've always remembered. Swamiji gave her the name Sadhana Devi, goddess or mother of sadhana. And she told me that she had the grace that meditation was something that was always easy for her, came early on in her, she just had the discipline. And she said, I know it's not easy for everybody to meditate, but for me, I meditate for everyone because I know it's a gift that I have. And I've always remembered that she said that. And then, of course, Durga, who came with Vidura, and the reason she was sought after for all those jobs is just as you see her doing, both of them doing up at the meditation retreat now, they always had a sense of class about them. Not class consciousness, but of not bringing everything to a level of refinement and organization. And wherever they went, whatever they did, it could be a little hole in the ground, they would make it, they could be a yurt at a community we had for a while at Ocean Song called, and whatever they did, they brought that beautiful, beautiful upliftment and kind of like the light shining from a little astral world. I remember once speaking of the long corduroy skirts and the bean boots, and we thought we were looking really good. I remember one time I was going on the rare trips to town with Durga, and I was trudging through the mud in my mud-covered bean boots, and I had this long, nondescript colored, nondescript shaped skirt on, and Durga looked at me and she said, I'm not going to town with you. And then, we're good friends, we're very good friends. And then, of course, my dear, dear friend, Jyotish, who from the very beginning just saw there were solutions. There were problems, but there were solutions. If it was trying to figure out how to earn a living, how to do a government, how to build houses, how to cut equal length strips of macrame, how to cut bamboo curtains into incense sticks, how to make incense from cow pies, whatever it was. He used the gift of his genius and creativity and devotion to Master to help solve problems, and still doing it today. I can't tell you the number of times he'll come out of our meditation room with his little notebook and he'll have all these ideas. We can do this, we can do this, we can do this. So it just, and I could go on and on. My life here, I don't know. I never felt I was anything special. I had the honor of doing many different things. I worked in the garden, and Auntie Maria could talk much more in depth and intelligently about the work we did in the garden. I worked in there for the first 5 years with our great mentor, Hanal Cassidy, who was a man, came to Ananda at Swamiji's request in his late 60s, and had been an organic gardener, among many other things, all over the world. And he trained us. But we were like the little kids coming to Nitai's class. We didn't know we had to be there on time. We didn't know we had to stay. We kind of liked playing with the hoe a little bit, and then we'd leave. And he took us and he trained us. And we were there at 7 o'clock in the morning because we had to be there early before it got hot. And some of us, well, he trained us. And he, on many, many levels. And for me, I had come from kind of a college background, never had done much of a practical nature in my life. And working in the garden was the most healing, uplifting, inspiring thing that I had ever done in my life. And there was things to be learned, so it wasn't just mindless. But and the soil, when my first encounter with my dear, dear friend Ananda, we were both raking this field, which is kind of, it's no longer in cultivation, but it's kind of, if you look at the market, it was to the left and behind. We were going to plant comfrey there because comfrey sends down these long tap roots that break up the clay. But Ananda and I were raking out there, and we looked, I didn't know her, she didn't know me. And she just looked at me and she said, "This is a very existential experience." She said, "This is like raking a sidewalk." And I looked at her and I knew that we were going to be friends forever. And we began talking, "Where are you from?" "Oh, well, I'm from St. Louis." "I'm from St. Louis." "Where?" And I mean, it was like we lived about a mile from each other. We'd gone to the same Girl Scout camp. You know, it was amazing. But it was, again, as Jai had described, those early experiences of bonding under adverse circumstances. And then I was one of the workers in Ananda and Shivani's candy shop. And talk about Bamal being covered with charcoal. Well, we had no heat it was another cathedral building, but up at the meditation retreat, but it was halfway done when we discovered we had built it not on our property. So we stopped construction on it, and again, we just covered it with plastic, but it had no heat at all. And so to make these Om bars and Deva Delights and Bhakti bars and Moksha bar, we had all these different ones. And we'd have to wear our down jackets. And so we'd come up to lunch at the meditation retreat, and we'd be encrusted with peanut butter and nuts and coconut. And they say, "Oh, you're making the Om bars today," because you could kind of tell what was on. And one time, the Divine Mother always had the best fun with the county officials, just as with Nitai. And so the health inspector came out, and we had no running water. We had no heat. We had propane lights. It didn't come up to health inspector standards. And so this man came, he was a nice man, but you could see his eyes started kind of spinning in his head, and he did have a clipboard. And he went into the storeroom where we kept the big bags of coconuts and so forth, but a little raccoon had gotten into it that night, so everything was, kind of chaotic. And he walked around and he said, "What do you make here?" And we so proudly, we held up a little bar, the little Om bar. We said, "We make these health food candy bars." And it had a pretty little label on it that we'd made. And he looked and he said, "You have to put the weight on the candy bar." And he left. And we said, "Okay." 2 ounces. That's what we did forever. And, we would literally melt snow on the little propane heater to wash the dishes, And anyway, all that to say, why were we here? I mean, it was funny, it was fun, but it was also not easy. It was cold, it was uncertain, it was lonely sometimes, it was unstable, all of those things. But we were here because everyone had different karma, but if we can sum it up, because we really wanted to have a spiritual life. We really were drawn to this path. We were really inspired by Swami's vision of communities, and were dedicated at whatever personal cost to do whatever little bit we could do, however unimportant it was, but doing our part. And we were here, I think, as Durga said, Swami said, we all had done communities before in the astral world, and so it was very familiar. It didn't seem strange at all. I had never camped out before in my life. Even at Girl Scout camp, I had a little tent cabin, and here I was living in a tree, first on the dirt, and then in a tree house, and then in a teepee, and then in a trailer. But there was something that resonated deep in our souls that we're supposed to do this. This will be of value. I remember that was one of my first thoughts when I came here, because I kept looking around, making a life decision. What could I do that would really be of value to anyone? I could be an anthropologist. That's what I'd studied. I could be a literature teacher. That's what I minored in. But I thought, do people need another anthropologist? Do they need another English teacher? I don't think so. But then when I came here, I thought this would really be of value to people. And whatever it takes, it just did not seem important. The price, we got paid by the piece. And the piece was peace with a P-E-A-C-E. We got the piece. And that was, whatever we did, we got paid with that piece. And the peace of mind was, I am finding who I am. I am discovering, I am fulfilling a deep yearning in my soul to have God's presence in my life. And I am doing something that I know will be of value to others. And everything else was just details. So we are so happy to share these stories. We could be here for many days telling you stories that would make you weep and make you laugh and shock you and awe you and all those different things. But the main thing is, Yogananda Ji came with a vision of a new way of life. He sang, as Swami has that beautiful song, Krishna's Flute. He played the flute of a way of life that was centered in God, expressed through harmony and cooperation, teamwork, creativity, dedication. And we heard that call, and we knew that this is the call that I came in to respond to, and I will pick up that charge from God and Guru, and I will carry it forward in whatever little way I can. And we're so happy to share all this with you. And we hope many of you sitting here will hear the call in your own heart, just as Nitai and Parv, Durga, Jyotish, Sadhana Devi, they said, oh, this needs to be done. And so look at Ananda right now and say, what is Master asking you to do? What's the next step? Not only for Ananda, but for you. Because ultimately, all of this is just about our own growth. So it's been such a wonderful life. I wouldn't have traded one moment of it. The good, the bad, and the ugly. I wouldn't have traded one moment of it. And I have a brother, one older brother, we were quite close as children, but then drifted apart, and now we're sort of coming back together. But I remember he lives south of Los Angeles, and when Swamiji, and we were living there in 2010 for 7 months, my brother came to some of the programs, and I remember he went up to Swamiji, and I don't think he took his hands, but he said, I want to thank you for the life you've given my sister. And I too want to thank Swamiji for the life that he gave us.
Prayer now, but then we'll take a very short, 5-minute break, and then those who would like come back and meditate together. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Shri Yukteswar, beloved Guru, Paramahansa Yogananda Ji, saints of all religions, we humbly bow to you all. We thank you again and again for the opportunity to live in thy light, in thy love, in thy harmony, and to be able to share it with all who would like that. Oh.